Sounds kinda bold, but I still believe television in 1959 understood human nature way better than a lot of works from 2026. The Twilight Zone. A black and white series that aired on CBS starting in 1959, ran for 5 seasons, with 156 episodes created by Rod Serling, truly sparked a real revolution. But honestly, the creepiest part of The Twilight Zone isn't just in those 156 episodes, it's in the stuff that clung to the show in real life. Sometimes it's a tiny detail so ridiculous it makes the whole system flinch. Sometimes it's Rod Serling's habits so strange they're almost borderline obsessive while writing scripts. And this terrifying classic series almost ended up becoming a sitcom. So today, let's open up 20 of the strangest facts about The Twilight Zone. If you think you already know this show, I'm afraid you've only been standing at the doorway. Number 20. A show from 1959. Understood people better than today. I'm saying this fully clear-headed as someone who's watched way too many movies and TV shows in my life. The Twilight Zone from 1959 understood people more deeply than plenty of works that came decades after it. People usually remember the show for its chilling twists, its bizarre imagery, and that unmistakable narration voice of Rod Serling. But to me, that's just the outer layer. What made this show immortal is that it looked at people with zero illusions. There are no polished heroes here, no chosen ones, just a salesman, a teacher, a housewife, a lonely man, just an ordinary person nudged half a step off course by life. And right at that moment, all their fear, greed, kindness, cowardice, hope, and even their darkest side comes spilling out. That's the real magic of The Twilight Zone. This show doesn't use the strange to escape reality. It uses the strange to strip reality down so we can see it clearly. That's why those stories still don't feel old today. And what makes me respect Rod Serling even more is that a show this sharp about human nature didn't come out of a time of the strictest censorship. That's fact number 19. Number 19. Rod Serling had to fight things stranger than monsters. What makes me admire Rod Serling isn't just how deeply he understood people, it's that he managed to do it inside a television system suffocating enough to meddle with even the tiniest details. To be exact, The Twilight Zone didn't just face monsters' nightmares or the apocalypse on screen. It also had to deal with sponsors' broadcast standards, and that very polite but very suffocating kind of fear in American television back then. The strangest example might be Judgment Night. A heavy episode like that, and the detail that got messed with, was a sailor ordering tea. Because a sponsor sold Sanka coffee, the word tea was considered uncomfortable, and Rod Serling had to change it into a tray being brought up to the deck. Just that alone is enough to make you laugh, and then feel a chill right after. Then there's a short drink from a certain fountain. Originally, the character Raymond Gordon was a family doctor. CBS didn't like the idea of a regular doctor willingly experimenting on people, so his profession got changed into a research scientist. That's the kind of control Rod Serling had to live with, not always cutting big scenes, but bending the moral spine of a story just to fit the system. And maybe that's exactly why he needed a place like The Twilight Zone to tell the truth in a roundabout way. Number 18. The Twilight Zone is a name that sounds like it existed before the show. I've always thought there are 2 kinds of titles. One just sits on the box, and then there's The Twilight Zone. It doesn't sound like something made up in a meeting room. It sounds like something that's been floating around for a long time, just waiting for the right person sharp enough to say it out loud. That's what makes me love this name so much. It doesn't just suggest an atmosphere, it creates one. The strange thing is, even Rod Serling wasn't completely sure he came up with it from scratch. Later on, he said he once thought it was his own idea, then realized Twilight Zone might have already existed, maybe even as a term in the Air Force. Honestly, nothing fits this show better than a name with an origin that foggy. Half memory, half instinct, half real, half dream. And then that name stepped right out of the show. It moved into everyday life, into dictionaries, into the way people describe moments that feel unreal and off from reality. To me, that's when the Twilight Zone stopped being just television. It became language. And maybe when a name sounds like it came out of midnight, it's no surprise the person using it is the kind of guy who sleeps next to a recording device. That's fact number 17. Number 17, Rod Serling. Slept next to a recorder, like he was afraid. His nightmares would vanish. There's a side story about Rod Serling that honestly feels creepier than a lot of details in the Twilight Zone itself. He kept a recorder right next to his bed, not like a neat professional tool, but like he knew certain ideas only show up when the house is asleep, when the human mind drifts into that in-between space, between dreaming and waking. And if you don't grab them right away, they're gone by morning, like cigarette smoke. Articles about Serling and his archives show that recording reading dialogue and dictating ideas into a machine was a very real part of how he worked. Thousands of his dictabelt recordings are still preserved today, and honestly, that fits the Twilight Zone in a way that's almost unsettling. This is a show that lives right on the fragile boundary between what can be explained and what can't. Rod Serling didn't just write about that space, he practically hunted his ideas inside it. I've always loved this detail because it makes him feel less like a stone monument and more like a man who understood that the best ideas don't knock during the day. They show up at 3 in the morning, whisper a few lines, and disappear if you don't jump up and catch them. And maybe that's why so many episodes of The Twilight Zone never sound like they were written under a desk lamp. They sound like they were pulled straight out of midnight. Number 16. Rod Serling opened the door to the audience and almost got buried under 14,000 scripts. Man, I've got to admit this. I really wish I could have lived in that exact moment. I'd love to slip a manuscript into an envelope, stamp it, and send it straight to the Twilight Zone. Too bad I was born way too late. Then again, to be fair, even if I had been there, maybe my script wouldn't have been good enough to make it through that door. Because Rod Serling really did open the door to the public. He gave viewers a chance to submit scripts, like he was saying, if you've got a story, strange enough, sharp enough, I'll listen. It was a beautiful idea, very American, very much from a time when television still made people believe talent could walk straight from the living room onto the screen. And then, the whole country practically flooded him. Around 14,000 scripts came in. A paper tsunami. And the brutal part is right there. Based on accounts later recalled, only about 2 were even decent, and even those didn't really fit the show. That just shows you having a strange idea is one thing. Turning it into the Twilight Zone is a whole different story. Number 15. Before becoming a legend. Rod Serling wasn't even the first narrator. Some things get tied so tightly to a work that we assume they were born together. The voice of Rod Serling is one of those things. Honestly, I can't even imagine the Twilight Zone with any other voice. But the truth is, in the pilot episode Where Is Everybody? The original narrator wasn't Serling, it was Westbrook Van Voorhis. And at one point, Orson Welles was even considered, but his fee was way too high. In the end, while everything was still in limbo, Rod Serling stepped into that gap. And that's the beautiful part. Something that started as a temporary solution turned into part of the soul of the entire show. Producer William Self felt Van Voorhis sounded too grand, too heavy in that old-school radio style. Serling was different. His voice wasn't majestic. It didn't try to sound mysterious. It was sharp, but tired, cold, but intelligent, like he had seen something behind the curtain of everyday life, and just wasn't interested in lying to the audience anymore. That wasn't just narration. That was the sound of a door opening. Rod Serling's voice was more unsettling than anything else they could come up with. Don't you think? Number 14, critics recognized it, while the public hesitated. You're probably used to the usual path of classic shows. The audience loves it. First, critics dismiss it, and only later come around. But The Twilight Zone didn't follow that path. The first people to recognize it as something special were the critics. They saw right away this wasn't just some black and white entertainment to fill a Friday night. They saw a show with its own voice, its own ambition, and most importantly, a cold but honest view of human nature. Meanwhile, the general audience at first was still standing at the doorway, unsure if this was something they wanted to step into. And then history answered for everyone. The ones who saw it early were right. The show didn't just survive, it endured it, thrived, and it grew into a monument. But in Hollywood, getting praised has never meant getting peace. Sometimes the better a show is, the harder it has to fight with money. Number 13, The Twilight Zone. Almost got crushed by money. People look at The Twilight Zone today as a monument and forget a very Hollywood truth: that monument lived in near constant financial strain. Starting from season 2, the show was under serious budget pressure. Many episodes had to be shot at lightning speed in just a few days, while still building an entirely new world every week. Just thinking about that tells you how stubborn and relentless Rod Serling and his team really were. The strangest move came when CBS tried to save money by forcing the show to shoot 6 episodes on videotape instead of film. Sounds reasonable on paper. In reality, it was almost a nightmare. Videotape back then was rough, hard to edit, restricted staging, and made the whole show feel like it was trapped inside its own technical cage. They saved a little money, but at the cost of stripping away part of what made The Twilight Zone feel alive. Then, there were delays with sponsors getting pulled off the schedule, then brought back again. The miracle is, it was still that good, still that successful. Number 12. In The Twilight Zone. There was one word almost no one was allowed to touch. There were times in American television when you could write about the end of the world, about sin punishment, about darkness swallowing a person whole, but you still had to be careful with exactly one word. In The Twilight Zone, that word was God. Richard Matheson once shared a behind-the-scenes detail so strange it makes me want to laugh and shiver at the same time. Only Rod Serling was allowed to use that word in scripts without it being crossed out. Nobody else. Think about how odd that is. Same show, same atmosphere, same sense of dread hanging over the page, but change the writer and suddenly one word becomes a problem. That's the kind of logic American television had back in the mid-20th century. It's not that the word itself was dangerous. The system just wanted to know who had the right to say it. Number 11. Ida Lupino was the most beautiful exception of The Twilight Zone. A lot of people assume The Twilight Zone was a world built by men sitting at writing desks, standing behind cameras, making all the decisions in control rooms. And right in that world, Ida Lupino stepped in like a rare and beautiful exception. She didn't just appear in front of the camera. Ida Lupino was the only person who both acted in The Twilight Zone and came back to direct an episode. On top of that, she was the only female director of the entire original 1959 run. That alone is enough to set her apart in the history of the show. To me, that's not just rare. That's the mark of someone with real strength. Ida Lupino carried that old Hollywood presence, calm, tough, sharp, the kind of person who doesn't need to be loud to command the whole room's attention. Number 10. The Twilight Zone almost turned into a sitcom. Some ideas are so wrong that just hearing them gives me chills. To me, one of those ideas is that somebody looked at The Twilight Zone and basically said, maybe we should throw in a laugh track and see what happens. And they really did it. Cavender is Coming was the only episode of the original run that ever got saddled with a laugh track just because CBS hoped it could turn into a sitcom pilot. Just think about that. What could possibly be more wrong than that? The Twilight Zone lives on silence, on that feeling that something is just a little off from ordinary life, on that uneasiness that slips under your skin so slowly that half the time you do not even notice it right away. A laugh track does the exact opposite. It almost turned the Twilight Zone into a sitcom, and that was a nightmare for the people who loved it. The funniest part is that later on, history itself had to correct that mistake. The laugh track got removed from the common syndicated and home video versions, like even the people who came afterward understood that laughter never belonged in this place. Thank goodness. Number 9. What so many people get wrong about Rod Serling. I have heard so many people pass this rumor around. A whole lot of people talk about the Twilight Zone, like Rod Serling sat there alone and wrote the entire show himself. Sounds nice. It also fits his legendary status perfectly. The only problem is it is not completely true. The truth is, Rod Serling wrote or co-wrote 92 out of the 156 episodes in the series. So no, he did not write every single thing. But honestly, that does not make me admire him any less. If anything, it makes me admire him more. Because this was not some ordinary series. This was a show where they pretty much had to come up with a whole new world, a whole new nightmare, a whole new moral lesson, and a whole new twist almost every week. And he still carried that many episodes. Of course, the Twilight Zone also had other important writers, but Serling was still the central voice. And once a show gets so big that people start remembering its creator wrong, then it is probably only a matter of time before it starts stepping off the screen in even stranger ways. Number 8. When the Twilight Zone turned into a board game, books, and even a cultural joke. It is hard to believe, in 1964, an American family could take the Twilight Zone out of the black and white TV and set it right down in the middle of the living room table. Just hearing that already feels a little off, and honestly, that is exactly what makes it so interesting. This show actually had an official board game from Ideal, with a surreal-looking box, a maze-style game board, and even a color spinner, like somebody really believed Rod Serling-style unease could be packed into a box and played after dinner. But it did not even stop there. The Twilight Zone also made its way onto the page with adaptation novels written by Rod Serling himself, and the moment that really made me laugh was finding out it even spawned a parody branch called the Looney Zone. That is the clearest sign of a cultural phenomenon right there. Number 7. The legendary opening of the Twilight Zone was just an offhand remark. Do you remember that legendary opening line from the Twilight Zone? Of course you do. How could anybody forget it? Today, the phrase "the fifth dimension" sounds like Rod Serling must have sat there polishing every word until it became a kind of spell. But it seems like the truth was a whole lot more casual than that. William Self once asked him a very simple question. If the first dimension is a line, the second is a plane, the third is a solid, and the fourth is time, then what is the fifth dimension? And Serling basically answered, I do not know. Aren't there 5 dimensions? I love that part, because it shows that sometimes a legend is not born from some perfect blueprint. It comes out of a moment that is quick, smart, and almost tossed off. And weirdly enough, that fits the Twilight Zone perfectly. Number 6. The Dummy was chosen by critics as the scariest episode. A lot of people still see this as one of the scariest episodes of the Twilight Zone, and I completely get why. What is scary here is not size or noise. It is the fact that a dummy imitates a human being, but never looks human enough to make you feel comfortable. It gets too close to life without ever really being alive. That tiny little gap is what gives people goosebumps. And that is where the Twilight Zone was always better than a whole lot of other horror stories. If just one dummy was enough to make this show that chilling, then get ready to keep going with me. We have now stepped into the final 5 strange facts. Number 5. The 6 strangest episodes of The Twilight Zone were not even shot the normal way. Some shows were born to be shot on film, and The Twilight Zone is absolutely one of them. So to me, one of the strangest facts in the whole series is that CBS actually decided at one point to save money by shooting 6 episodes on videotape instead of film. At first glance, that just sounds like a small technical change, but really, it made the whole show feel different. The problem was that videotape in the early 60s was a whole lot rougher, almost forcing them to shoot like live television with multiple cameras at once, making clean editing really difficult, and pretty much choking off the chance to shoot on location. For a series that lived on that uneasy space between a dream and a nightmare, like The Twilight Zone, that was not a small price to pay. Those 6 episodes were The Lateness of the Hour Static, The Whole Truth, The Night of the Meek, 22 and Long Distance Call. The savings were only about $5,000 per episode, and in the end, they still had to go back to film. Number 4. There was a season. When The Twilight Zone got stretched to 1 hour. A lot of people remember The Twilight Zone as a half-hour show, tight and sharp, getting right to the point, and then closing with one cold twist. And honestly, that is the shape that has always felt right to me too. But there is one detail not everybody notices. There was a season when the show got stretched out to 1 hour. That was season 4. Did you ever notice that, if you have ever rewatched the whole series and suddenly felt the rhythm slow down and get heavier, like the story was breathing in a different way, then chances are you had stepped right into that season. Seasons 1, 2, 3, and 5 were all half-hour episodes. Season 4 alone got changed by CBS into a different time slot, which made every episode twice as long. It sounds like a gift for the audience, but with The Twilight Zone, longer was not always better. Number 3. The Twilight Zone did not die. Just because of ratings. People really love neat little answers. A show got cancelled because of ratings. That sounds simple, easy to remember, and easy to repeat in one sentence. But with The Twilight Zone, it was not that neat. Sure, the drop in viewership was part of the story, but it was only part of it. This show was also dealing with all kinds of pressure at the same time. Money was always a problem. Sponsors were unstable. The broadcast schedule kept getting shuffled around. The format even got changed at one point. The whole machine behind the scenes felt like it was running in a state of constant exhaustion. And then there was one more thing that I think is the saddest part. Rod Serling himself was starting to run out of steam. After all those years of writing, producing, and straining to keep the show alive, he just was not looking at that fight with the same energy he had in the beginning. So saying, The Twilight Zone died only because of ratings is the fast version, not the accurate version. It did not go down from one single blow. It got worn down little by a bunch of things all at once. And that is what makes it sad. Number 2. Rod Serling admitted himself that not every episode of The Twilight Zone was good. There is something about Rod Serling that I have always admired even more than his talent, and that is how honest he was. He did not look at The Twilight Zone like some precious treasure that had to be overly protected. He looked at it like a skilled craftsman looking back at his own years of labor, clear-eyed, demanding, and not fooling himself. Serling once admitted that about 1/3 of the episodes were pretty good, 1/3 were okay, and 1/3 were just plain bad. A lot of people might be surprised to hear that, but to me, that statement actually makes him even bigger, because only somebody who is truly serious about the work would talk that way about his own creative child. He did not paint the legend in gold. He understood way too well the price of having to write non-stop to race deadlines, the network, the sponsors, and his own strength and ideas. And maybe that is what really set Rod Serling apart. He was honest enough to see what was imperfect and still left behind a legacy so big that television history cannot ignore it. And now, it is time for us to get to the final strange fact and wrap up today's list. Number 1. The Twilight Zone was not just successful, it got stamped as a legend. After everything this show had to go through, censorship sponsors, money problems, time slot changes, failed experiments, and even Rod Serling's own exhaustion. The thing that feels most satisfying to me is this. The Twilight Zone did not just survive. Television history called it by the right name. Even while the series was still on the air, Rod Serling won an Emmy for writing connected to this show. Then the science fiction community took The Twilight Zone seriously too through the Hugo Awards. And many decades later, the Writers Guild of America ranked it number 3 on the list of the best written series in television. To me, that is the biggest stamp of all. The Twilight Zone was not just a successful show. It was one of the finest moments American television ever had. Every time I look back at The Twilight Zone, I think about an era when screens were still black and white, when light and shadow still knew how to tell stories in their own way. And honestly, I still like black and white movies more than color images. They have depth, loneliness, and a kind of magic that modern color sometimes tries so hard to reach and still cannot quite touch. The Twilight Zone belongs exactly to that kind of magic. So before we wrap this up, let's take a moment to thank the greatest legend in suspenseful and compelling television storytelling. Thank you to Rod Serling for being a real legend. Now, it is your turn. Share the episode you love most, a memory you have with this show, or even better, tell me another strange fact I missed. And if you love these trips back to the golden age, the way I do, subscribe to the channel and wait for me to come back on the next trip through time. But there is something interesting about the shows that live the longest in our memories. The more familiar they feel, the easier it is to think we already know everything about them. But behind it, there is an entire layer of backstage stories that many viewers have never heard. So today, we are heading back to Hazard County and uncovering the most fascinating secrets behind the Dukes of Hazzard. And trust me, a few of them may make you see this series in a completely different way.